It's now my privilege to introduce our next speaker, Professor Drazen Prelec. Drazen is a professor who actually holds 3 appointments at MIT, one in the Sloan School of Management, one in the Department of Economics, and the Department of Brain and Cognitive Sciences, the department I told you about earlier. His area of work is called neuroeconomics, and the title of his talk today is The Brain as Decision Maker. So, Professor Prelec.
Thank you, Jim. I'm delighted to be representing here 3 departments, and in fact, neuroeconomics itself represents a marriage of 2 disciplines. And if you look at the 2 disciplines in question, there's something paradoxical about it. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what each discipline contributes to the marriage, and especially what economics contributes, because economics, after all, is based on a notion of a rational agent, a person, an ideal notion of a decision maker. And we know that theory is largely incorrect, largely false. And one thing I'd like to convey is the value of having a theory that's both strong, wrong, that makes stark, clear predictions, but that is also, in some sense, fundamentally incorrect. Now, economics is a new discipline. How new? About 10 years ago, there was a conference held at Martha's Vineyard, and the folks you see on this picture is essentially the field, most of the field, at 10 years ago. And 2 things one could say is it's a bunch of men, and they're mostly middle-aged. Every one of them, except one, I think, has tenure. And so the field was essentially an enterprise of people who had secured tenured positions and could experiment. It's completely different today. What we have today is a thriving discipline with thousands of participants. And 2 things that are really, I think, worth noting is, one is the center of gravity has moved towards the younger generation, towards the doctoral students, the postdocs, the junior faculty that are driving the field forward. The other thing that's also remarkable is that whenever you have a new discipline, it creates its own ghetto, its own set of journals and publications. In this case, however, neuroeconomics articles have actually invaded the standard science and neuroscience journals, as well as the standard finance and economics journals. And that's, I think, a remarkable sign of health in our scientific enterprise, because most of those journals, or the editors of those journals, had to take a gamble to accept such different, methodologically different, and often very risky publications. But in any case, the field is very large and vigorous. Now, I said a lot of economics, and economics as a model of decision maker that's incorrect, and it gets us to focus on the mistakes that people make. Why is that valuable? Let me start with an example from perception. This is an example of a visual illusion. If you look at the 2 patches here, patch A and patch B, they're actually the same shade. They don't look the same. But if we cover them up, if you cover up the surrounding, you see the same shade of gray. Now, and if we expand the surroundings, we see that they actually look very different. So the visual system is making an incorrect decision. And this is extremely interesting because it raises 2 questions. One is, what are the computations that are involved that lead to this mistake? The other, is this a fortunate mistake? Is there some value, some benefit in the visual system actually not responding directly to the reflectance of the surface? Now, let's turn to the area of decisions. What is a mistake? What is a mistake in a decision? Well, it's much harder to diagnose something as a mistake when we make decisions. It's not obvious. And so it's useful to have a gold standard of what an ideal decision maker would do. And that's what economics, by and large, provides. So let me give 3 examples of, sort of 3 principles of rational decision making. One is separations of means and ends. that people have pre-existing desires and preferences before they reach the point of choice. And then they essentially have a menu of options, and they choose the one which has highest utility. Second principle is transparency, that if you describe the same options in slightly different ways, the decision is not going to be affected. And the third is consequentialism, which is that decisions should be evaluated by their consequences. These seem innocent, but if you look at closely, people violate these in very striking ways. Now, I'd like to make a distinction. This is not a distinction in literature, but I think it's important for understanding how neuroscience and economics relates. A distinction between choices and decisions. A choice is like a choice between a Coke and a Pepsi. There are two options, and you choose one. And we make choices, animals make choices, and economic theory has a theory of choice that's by and large correct, meaning that we choose the option that's preferred. And so the neuroscience question then becomes, how does the brain computationally implement that choice? How does it compute the values of the options? And how does it decide which one is better? And how does it translate that into a decision? And I think a computational theory is pretty much, I would say, around the corner. That is a theory that's going to involve neurons, ensembles of neurons, and that's going to draw on animal studies where animals actually make choices between beverages, typically. So this is a situation where economics and neuroscience work hand in hand in a relatively standard way. Now, on the right hand, you see an example of a decision. And I have to say this is my distinction, and it's not a distinction in literature. Now, there's a queue of people, and what are those people doing? Those people are waiting to vote. And why is that puzzling? Well, it's puzzling from the standpoint of economics, and maybe even common sense, because everybody knows that their vote is not going to affect the outcome. That is, in fact, I can tell you the chance that your vote will affect the outcome mathematically is somewhere of the order of, in Massachusetts, several billions, one in several billion. So why do people vote? It's obvious they won't affect the outcome. Now, economists have puzzled over this because they tend to take the rational model literally, and here the consequences are zero. And so you could say they vote because they like the ceremony, they like to be seen by their neighbors, they like to participate, and so on. But that can't be the whole story, because imagine if that voting booth, someone announced that voting booth is broken, and therefore nobody's vote will count, but you can still come in and go through the ceremony and mark it. It's just not going to count. It's pretty sure that everybody would give up and go home at that point. So somehow we feel, for example, if there's an election that was your candidate lost by a few hundred votes, you feel guilty. You feel that you could have affected the outcome. There's a certain magical feeling that your vote actually could have had more impact. Now, that magical feeling is, I think, characteristic of every genuine decision. Genuine decisions are not circumscribed by their consequences. And that's essential for self-control and for collective actions and for civilization. Most acts of self-control have trivial consequences. When you don't eat the cake after dinner, that has a minimal consequence on your weight. But somehow you feel that if you do, you're going to eat the next one, and so on. So our ability to exercise self-control and to act collectively hinge on a kind of a magical sense that most of our actions have deeper, more profound consequences. They signify something about ourselves, about our collective, that's not there in the literal consequences of the choice. And so now that is a large challenge it's a challenge for economics, because economics really can't deal with that at present, but it's also a challenge for neuroscience. It's also likely to be a feature of the brain that's uniquely of human brains. So I'm going to now give you 3 examples that deal with decisions, and they deal with decisions in 3 domains. One is purchasing. The other is self-deception. Self-deception meaning, do we see what we wish to see? Do we process information the way that it's convenient? And the third one is trust. How do we decide whom to trust? And this is a sample of research that I have been involved with, so it's very selective. And I'd like to give you also a feeling for what it's like to be a subject in experiments, because each of these experiments has been conducted in the scanner. And as Rebecca said, scanner is a very unusual environment. And one of the constraints in running scanner experiments is that you have to ask a person to do the same thing, or more or less the same thing, many times, 100 times. So some of the craft is actually converting a real psychological phenomena into a repetitive task that will somehow capture something of the essence of that phenomenon. So let's turn first to shopping or purchasing. Is a purchase a choice or a decision? And how would you know? Well, one of the differences between a choice and a decision is when you have a choice, you're choosing between Coke and Pepsi, and you decide you want Coke, and you enjoy the Coke. You don't subtract the pleasure of the Pepsi that you would have had from the pleasure of the Coke. You enjoy the Coke because that's the better choice. That's simple. Now, if you decide to purchase something, there's a cost. And it turns out psychologically that cost enters into your satisfaction with the purchase. It actually imposes a kind of a psychological tax on consumption. It hurts to some extent. And strictly speaking, that's irrational. Now, an anecdote happened to me, just to kind of illustrate the point. I was once lucky enough to be upgraded to a business class airplane ticket right at boarding. And so I settled in on the flight and was happy as a clam. And then when we took off, it turns out there was a malfunction in the bank of seats, and they didn't recline fully. And the folks next to me were just livid, and they were complaining, and they went back and forth, and so on. They were probably paying full fare. And I couldn't care less. And so, in some sense, we were having the same experience. But the fact that theirs was costly really took a lot of the satisfaction away. And to an economist, that is simply crazy. So now we're going to look at, can we find that traces of the cost in the scanner in brain imaging? So this is a scanner where the experiments were done. And what you see is, this is now a shopping experience from the perspective of a subject. You see a fixation, you see a product for 4 seconds, Godiva chocolates, you see a price, and then you make a decision, and then you see a next product, and so on and so forth. This is real money and real decisions. And you have 40 of these. And one thing that's remarkable, maybe I'm sort of to a naive person like me, is that you have an individual that's perfectly still, just moving their fingers, making decisions, and there's nothing dramatic happening in terms of their blood flow, etc. But the brain picks up a difference between when they like the product and also when they see the price. So we're going to look at now at activity in the striatum, which we can think of as an early reward indicator. And the blue line are occasions when they purchased a product. This is when and the red line are products that were not purchased. Here they see the product, here they see the price, and here they make a decision. And essentially the products that they liked were registered right there in the striatum, which is part of the dopaminergic circuit, reward circuit. Now, a second area that tracks reward, and this is the closest to utility meter that exists in the brain, so far as we know, is the medial prefrontal cortex. And again, when they see the product, the blue line is higher, meaning these are the products that they eventually buy. Then when they see the price, the difference, the gap is still there. And then when they finally decide to purchase, still it remains high. The blue line, the purchased products, is high. Interestingly, activity in this medial prefrontal cortex correlates not so much with their liking for the product, but with the difference between the liking for the product and the price. So it's really tracking the difference between satisfaction and the cost, not just satisfaction itself. So the cost appears as a debit. And finally, if we look at an area, insula, which is associated with aversive feelings, even disgust, the red line are rejected products it springs to life, as it were, when they see the price for products that are rejected. So we see here, we can think of this, I said a purchase is a decision. It's a decision because it implicates feelings of guilt and self-control. We don't want to overspend, and part of what keeps us from overspending is this anxiety about the cost itself. Now, a second study is a self-deception study. Now, what key question in self-deception is, of course, is when we see the world the way we want it to be, as opposed to the way it is. Key question in self-deception is it a passive process that we simply somehow accidentally pick up information that's congenial, or does the brain at some level register the bad information and then suppresses it? This is an approach that goes back to Freud, and it's an approach that's been extremely controversial, and the experiment I'm about to describe is designed to shed some light on it. Now remember, we have to create a self-deceptive moment dozens of times in the scanner. This is what makes the experiment a little bit unusual. How does it work? You are asked to judge whether, first of all, you have to be a person who doesn't speak Korean. So this is a Korean sign, but it's presented as an aesthetic object. And the question is it more male or female-like in appearance? And if you guess correctly, you get 5 cents. And correct means that you agree with the judgments of others. So it's purely consensus. Is this one more male? I can tell you this one is. Does anyone want to guess? For male, who says for male? Female? You're absolutely right, that's female. If you're curious, the ones on the right are are male, the ones on the left are female. Female ones tend to have circles, tend to have more detail, and tend to have more diagonals, wispy strokes, things like that. I've been accused that this is a sexist study, but that's the way the data is shaken out. Now, what's self-deceptive about it? Well, what you're asked to do is also something else in this task. You're asked to, the fixation comes on, you're asked to predict whether the next sign is going to be male or female. Predict, meaning take a lucky guess. And then when you see it, judge whether your prediction is correct. And the point of this prediction is that if you're a good predictor, not only will you get 5 cents for each correct judgment, but you'll get a $20 bonus at the end. And that creates a temptation to change your opinion. That is, if you predict this is going to be female, and then, or let's say you predicted this is going to be male, and you see it, now you could say, well, maybe it looks kind of male in the end, okay? And so the issue is, do people change their mind to make themselves right? In fact, they do, and they do this, not everybody, but most people do. And so here's how it works. Now, why is this? If you think this is a silly task, the idea is to capture something that happens in everyday life. You have a person who's working on some remote task. They get signs of progress. They have to tell themselves how well they're doing, how well their dissertation is doing. And they get no feedback until the end, until there's a final exam, let's say. So this is just like in our experiment. Only in the end do you find out how good you were. So what happens is in the first round, we actually ask people to rate these signs just for 5 cents accuracy to get a record of what they think is male or female. And then we ask them to predict for each one whether it's male, and then judge after they see it. And we're really interested in these, as I said, these judgments where they originally thought it was male, then when they make a prediction, they say it's female, and then when they see it, they say, gee, it actually is female. These are self-deceptive judgments. And what happens in the scanner when they do that, just to cut the story short, people who are vulnerable to these kinds of self-deceptive judgments exhibit 3 characteristics in a self-deceptive judgment. Their response is very fast, so they don't linger on the judgment. They have greater activation in the areas of the brain which are associated with cognitive control, with clamping down, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And they also have some indication of greater reward in a self-deceptive judgment. So a self-deceptive judgment is quick, it requires a stamping out of information, and there's an aha of satisfaction. And one of my colleagues said, the purest form pleasure is relief. What happens in a self-deceptive judgment is you disconnect the information and experience some relief. And my final, third study, and this is going to go by very quickly, is an investment task. And this was, internally we called it the Bernard Madoff study, but you'll see why. We gave subjects $8,000 of play money, of real money, and they could invest it in about 100 different banks and make interest. So this is what they saw. They saw the face of an advisor, and then they saw an offer. If you invest $50, you're going to get either 0.5 to 4.5% interest, or you can invest $50 but have more risk, 2% or 6% interest, or you can reject this bank altogether and move on to another bank. And anything you earn is yours to keep. You return the $8,000 at the end, but you could get quite a lot from each choice. For example, with the $50, 6%, you might make $3 just for that choice. So these are experiments where subjects walk away with $50, $100 easily. Now you might ask yourself, why reject any offer? Why reject any offer? Well, there's a catch. What we tell subjects is that at a few of these banks, one or two, are going to take away their money, that they fail, and not only will they not get the interest, they're going to lose the principal. And there's no information about which banks there are, except potentially the face of that person in the middle. Now, what do we know about the face? Well, the face, the subjects don't know, but the face is actually a blend, a morph of the subject's own face and the advisor's face. It's in about 1/3 of the cases. And how does the morph work? Well, many months earlier, we have obtained images of the faces of these subjects who volunteered them. We actually paid them. We didn't tell them, said, would you like to donate your face? It'll be used in a future experiment. Sure, why not? And laboriously, we combined their own face with the face of the advisor, keeping the superficial, the hair, the eyeglasses the same, but the structure, it's sort of like you have a distant relative. So in the middle and the bottom, you see a frame. On the right is an advisor, on the left is a subject, and the bottom is a 50% mixture. How does this work? This is, let me try to show you a little movie. I guess not. Maybe I can do it like this. Just a second. No matter. This would have been a movie of me being morphed into former dean of... sorry. Okay. Of... into... Well, you don't see it, but there's a gradual morph of Glenn Urban, former dean of the Sloan School, into my face. Spectacular, but I guess not. So what happens in this case? If you're curious, the offers on the left are less trustworthy faces. The offers on the right are more trustworthy faces. And in particular, in the brain region, what we're interested in is whether the amygdala, which has been implicated in processing of implicit trust, specifically indicates rejection of offers and self-morph faces. And the findings are self-morph faces indeed are rated as much more trustworthy and elicit more accepted offers. And initial amygdala activation is associated with offer rejection. And it's a relatively weak effect, but it's also more active with faces that are not morphed with yourself. And I have to end, this is a little bit of a, this is not serious, and this slide, it won't appear in any publication, but who is the most trustworthy individual we can think of? Of course, is George Washington on the $1 bill, and one of the RAs just pointed out that what we have here is a striking resemblance. So, and I want to end with thank many collaborators and put in a plug for our Sloan Neuroeconomics Lab.